Now, though, very happy to have on the show Andrea Pitzer. She's a journalist, author of various books, including the very compelling book from a few years ago, One Long Night: A Global History of Concentration Camps. Hi, Andrea. How are you? By the way, is it Andrea or Andrea?
I grew up in West Virginia, so I say Andrea to not put on airs, but you can say anything you want.
All right, Andrea. No, whatever it is, I forgot to ask you in the break before we came on. So, first of all, the book is really compelling. You also wrote an op-ed for MSNBC saying, "Don't call it alligator Alcatraz, call it a concentration camp." So, I'm glad you're on to talk about this. First of all, I want you to share with people what is a concentration camp, so we have a definition that we can agree on.
So, for the purposes of my book, and I went all over the world, and talked to people
Hmm.
who'd been in these things and looked at history for ones that were from a long time ago. And the basic idea is that it is mass detention of civilians. So we're not talking POW camps, right? We're talking civilians. Mass detention of
Hmm.
civilians without any real trial. If there's any kind of trial, it's a show trial on the basis not of some crime that they've committed, but instead on the basis of identity. So that could be race, ethnicity, political affiliation, religion. So on that idea of who they are rather than something specific that they've done. And it's almost always done as a way to consolidate or expand political power.
And concentration camps, as you note in your book, there's a history of it going back to Spain coming to Cuba and through more of the modern era, of course, the most notable one being the Nazis, but the Gulag and the Soviet Union you write about in your book. When you look at this big picture here, when you see a concentration camp now in America, what is that? What alarm bells go off for you? What is going on in your mind as you watch Donald Trump with Alligator Alcatraz?
So, my big motivation to write the book was that it didn't exist. First of all, there wasn't a book that said, hey, how did this idea come into the world and what happened with it? But it was also, how did we get to something like Auschwitz, which is what people think of when they hear the word
Right.
concentration camp, right? And Auschwitz was a death camp. It was one of just a handful, but that came after 9 years of pre-existing concentration camps in Nazi Germany. So I wanted to trace this idea of how did we get there and then what happened to that concept afterward. And so many people are rightfully noting that like what's happening right now in the Everglades is not a million people being murdered in gas chambers. And that's absolutely
Right.
correct. But the point of my book was it doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? There are precedents for
Hmm.
that. And a lot of those precedents are what we're seeing right now. This taking a group of people who are part of a functioning society, as immigrants have been for centuries in the US, moving them outside of it, making them extra legal, making it impossible to exist legally there, and detaining them behind barbed wire, and then demonizing them even further in conditions that are inhumane. And so when we read about what's happening, and reports have come out already from the first prisoners, right? There's maggots in the food. They don't have access to water. People who have meds are not able to access their meds. Somebody took a Bible away from a guy and said, you don't get any religion in here. These are the reports that we're hearing. And this is week one. And what I did with my book was to trace what happens when you let that stuff fester. So we're starting out with people already being kidnapped off the streets by
Hmm.
agents who are masked, right? Like these are not good places to start from. This is way down the line of a lot of places that installed concentration camps. This is more like what you saw 3, 4 years in. And so I think that we need to be aware as a country how quickly this can get much, much worse.
And I think the point you make is so important. The demonization and the dehumanization by Donald Trump of immigrants, of migrants. And if you speak out for them at all, be it Abrego Garcia or anyone else, you're supporting any crime they're accused of by this regime and that they want to silence us. But the dehumanization is what leads to laying the groundwork for genocide, or at least the very little, not caring about the people that you might hear about in this camp. And that's deeply alarming. Did you see that in the other, obviously in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, the demonization of the Jews were intended to dehumanize them. But was that also a trait that you would saw in other concentration camps of the people who were housed there?
Yes, it's absolutely. I would say, the first decade of the camps were like colonial attempts to snuff out independence movements, and so it was a lot of peasants and things that were locked up. And then in World War I, which was the next sort of big decade of camps, it was just this global internment, which people know about. People were locked up, even though they hadn't committed crimes during the course of the war. But it's after that, in the 20s, 30s, like you were talking about with the Soviet Gulag, where
Hmm.
anybody that was opposed to the regime became an enemy of the state. And of course, this is language that Donald Trump has already used for reporters. He has suggested that immigrants are destroying the country, and the rhetoric many people have
Hmm.
noticed is very similar to what's been used for German Jews. And it's important to know because I think almost nobody recalls this, but in the 1920s, a decade before Hitler came to power, he wrote about what his goal was. And his goal was to strip German Jews of being allowed to be in Germany, of having citizenship in Germany, literally to turn them into illegal aliens. And when you see the Nazis come in 1933, that's what they do. They don't start with the roundups. They start with stripping them of citizenship. They can't hold university professorships. They can't use public hospitals. They can't be in parks. They make it impossible to exist in Germany, in that state. And then what happens is they want them to self-deport. And this is the same language that we hear Kristi Noem using. She was using it when she was visiting Alligator Alcatraz, as they're calling it. And it was this idea that, oh, we're giving them a chance to get out. But that didn't work in Nazi Germany, and it's not going to work in the US, where the number of immigrants is just enormous. And they are threatening to deport the kind of numbers they're talking about. They've said 20 million, 24 million, some tout even more. This is actually more than the number of undocumented immigrants in the US. And so I think we have to assume that the patterns that have held in the past can easily repeat here. I would say that the level of demonization that has bled over to the Democrats, even who are afraid to stand up to it for paying a political cost in terms of they don't want to be seen as coddling immigrants. I think that having at the RNC last election, ahead of the last election, these mass deportation now, we're in a bad place. And I really think Americans who don't want it to happen will need to stand up against it in some way, because the other thing that we've seen is these things do not stop on their own. They absolutely do not.
Oh, absolutely true. I mean, I was saying early on in this regime when they arrested Mahmoud Khalil, the student with the green card. I told everyone you have to care. It doesn't end with a student with a green card. It starts there. It starts with the undocumented. It continues down the path. Now, you talk about in your article for MSNBC that Alligator Alcatraz is a concentration camp, and I have to ask you this: that for Alligator Alcatraz, they're selling merch on the Republican website. Oh, you can buy a thermos, a hat. Did the Nazis sell merch for any of their death camps, or
No, there
is
was
this a
not.
different level of like I'm not even. I know it's kind of jokey, but at the same time, it tells you how devoid of humanity the Republicans are, where they can sell that. Where even the Nazis didn't sell merchandise for Auschwitz. And that's what I'm getting at. Even though I know it is kind of funny, I get that part of it. I am also a comedian by trade. But the deeper meaning here is that there's a level of inhumanity by this Republican Party that might rival some of the worst actors on in the history of time.
So they're not there yet, but the trajectory we're on is not a good one. And I will say that while merch for Nazi concentration camps was not a thing, um, it very much is in the tradition that has happened almost since the beginning, but certainly at least since the Gulag and the Nazi camps, that there is a desire by the party in power to do two things with it. To do it very publicly because they're
Hmm.
catering to their base, right? They want to consolidate power.
Hmm.
So they want to feed this red meat to their supporters and their base and to seem incredibly powerful to them and to sort of gratify their worst desires. But at the same time, they want to terrorize the target population. So there has always been this, like the merch is a very public PR thing, right? There has always been
Right.
this PR side alongside the secret, keep it quiet terror side. These things vie in the public arena for which one dominates at which time. So, for instance, with the Nazis, they also brought in journalists. They brought a Times of London journalist in 1933. They brought a New York Times reporter in to Dachau in 1933. They would stage kind of you know, villages. I mean, there's famous things where they brought Red Cross observers, they brought different people in, and created fake narratives. And the Soviets too, they had a camp called Solovki that was up at the Solovetsky Islands, and it was this subarctic camp that was horrific. And there were so many, there was death there, there was people were freezing, there were mosquito tortures. It was infamous. And at the same time, they were trying to advertise that they're the new people's, republic in terms of what they were doing. And they made a film about all the amazing, wonderful things at Solovki. And in fact, they overdid it so much they couldn't show it in Russia because people were starving and everything was awful. And they're like, why do these people in a concentration camp have it so much better than we do? And that was something I even found when I went into the Rohingya camps, which was a camp, our camps targeting a minority Muslim group in Myanmar. I actually sneaked into those camps when I was researching this. And when I talked to people in the surrounding villages about how do you feel about your neighbors having been put in camps 3 years ago and they can't get out, and they said, why do they have toilets? We don't have toilets. Why do they get toilets?
Wow.
And so there was this resentment because the government had suggested that in fact these people were not being abused, but were being treated royally. And I'm sure that we will see things about how spoiled the Everglades prisoners are, the detainees, because of course prisoner is somebody who's actually convicted. But we will see something about how these Everglades detainees are actually being coddled and spoiled at some point, because this is another inevitable part of the rhetoric that goes around this. But they do want to terrorize at the same time.
Certainly. And, you talk about the distinction between prisons, which we have due process. People have certain constitutional rights here in America. The Trump's goal is to end due process for migrants. And the people in the camps, they get very upset. The idea that how dare they have hearings? We shouldn't have hearings. We should be able to do whatever we want to them. And that has to hearken to the darkest days of other concentration camps, the way they treated people in there. There is no due process. You go into a camp because we say you're going to that camp, and the only way you get out is either dead or we let you out at some point.
Well, actually, one thing to just clarify, because there have been a lot of different kinds of camp systems that often people do come out for a period of time. And this can be one reason why people mistake thinking a system may not be that serious yet. So even if we use the extreme case of Nazi Germany, it was 5 years after the Germans had been hoping the Jews would self-deport, and they didn't, that they did Kristallnacht, which was this was a couple nights of state terror in November 1938. Tens of thousands of Jews for the first time were rounded up as a group and were detained. But more than 90% of those were released within a year. The idea was still at that point to try to get them to leave the country. And it wasn't till that was not functioning and the rest of the world said, we're not taking these refugees, that things got worse. And so I think you'll see sometimes people coming out of some of this kind of detention, whether it's through legal rulings but we shouldn't mistake that for meaning this system, isn't quite so bad. And then I also want to put a word in just to say the U.S. prison system is, though due process is officially part of it, is the U.S. detains an incredible number of people. It routinely vies for having the democracy with the most people incarcerated. And so it's partly by tolerating a system like that I think we have an immigration detention system that under many presidents has already abused a lot of rights. And sometimes people will write me and say, well, what about the other presidents? And I say, that was terrible too. And you can always take something inhumane and make it more horrific, which is kind of the history of concentration camps. And so I think that we have to look at all this kind of detention if we're actually going to fix this problem. But what we're now looking down the barrel of with this new budget funding, the massive amount that's going to be going to ICE detention, means it might actually end up rivaling the prison system for the number of beds with people detained, which is just staggering to contemplate.
And, we obviously had concentration camps on the mainland of the U.S. during World War II with the Japanese internment camps. I mean, those I would imagine are they look like what a concentration camp would look like. In your book, you go through, and I think you touch on the article as well, that the first Nazi concentration camps were for political prisoners. They weren't for the Jews. And in Dachau, right? That was the first one. And they put communists in there and socialists and others, and some they re-educated and let out. Some they treated horribly. But are you concerned that once this gets unleashed with Donald Trump, that we're going to see U.S. citizens in concentration camps? And just to remind people, on July 3rd, on the eve of Independence Day, Donald Trump had a rally in Iowa where he said, I hate Democrats. He said point blank, I hate Democrats. I really hate them. I can't stand them because they hate America. That's what he said to the crowd, and the crowd cheered. And I have to be blunt here, Andrea. I have zero doubt that if Donald Trump said I have to put Democrats in camps, overwhelmingly the MAGA base would cheer and be on board with it. So my question is, do you think that's where we might be heading?
Um, I think that in my experience, you need a lot of propaganda to get enough of a majority of a country to go along with the most extreme stuff. And we've seen immigrants demonized for years. And I think that's why it's
Mm-hmm.
strategically starting there, right? And I think it will take them some time longer before they could do that. I think we have lots of chances to intervene. But from the beginning, from when Trump came down that escalator in 2015, I have been saying that there is, in terms of his temperament and what he says he wants to do, there is nothing that distinguishes him from most of the worst strongmen of the 20th century. It is simply his institutional inability to carry out those desires. And what we're seeing so far in this second administration is that anybody else in the party that was willing to stand against him, the generals that were willing to stand against him, those guys are being purged. And so certainly that is where this picks up its own momentum, right? That's where this will
Mm-hmm.
go without interruption. And yet I do want to be clear, like we are not there yet. But what we are already doing is we're hearing about in these ICE sweep situations where somebody says, no, that's my employee. They're an American citizen. I have their ID inside. Let me go get it. And they will still cart people off and make because somebody's filming or because somebody's arguing with them. And so they're already making examples, even if they let them go later, of these U.S. citizens. We already see the error with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was deported, and it was clear it was a mistake. His lawyer said in court it was a mistake, and yet the government is trying to still make an example of him. And so I think already making these borders gray, that it is not just criminal aliens, who I would argue still deserve due process, but they're saying that it's just criminals. And there's anything between 8% of them are violent criminals. A majority of them appear not to have criminal records at all, depending on which baskets you're talking about. They're clearly misrepresenting that. And what we know from history, and again, is as soon as it's okay to do it to any one group, then you can always move the goalposts. Once you do it with one, it's exponentially easier to expand it to a second or third or fourth group. And I think journalists, Democrats, one of the Trump sons was saying horrific stuff about trans people being the worst threat to the country. I mean, I think that there's a thing I called the concentration camp tendency, which is this idea of isolating certain groups and saying they don't belong in society or they don't have full rights to society. And it's at the core of almost everything the Trump administration does. We see them removing Black people and women from positions of leadership. We see there's all these people that do not belong in public, that do not belong in power. And I think it is possible that given leeway, Trump would move against any of those groups.
Yeah, I have zero doubt Donald Trump would put every critic in a camp if he could do that. But he doesn't have to, because Russia's a country of 145 million. There's about 1,500 political prisoners. That's enough to deter others from speaking out. You don't have to put 20 million. You just make a spectacle of 1,000 or 2,000. And that really has an impact on human beings. Although I think Americans in our DNA, rebelling against a king is part of who we are. But you mentioned in your book, and you mentioned it here as well, how Hitler wanted to strip citizenship from Jews in Germany who were actually citizens. And we just saw a memo. You may or may not have seen this, that the DOJ is now, quote, prioritizing denaturalization and not looking into denaturalization, prioritizing. It's actually in the Department of Justice memo. And I was on MSNBC Saturday morning talking about it with Ali Velshi, how the basis they have for that, the 10 different compartments, one of them is if you were a potential threat to national security, potential, not imminent, not concrete, potential threat, they are beginning the process of going beyond migrants to naturalized citizens to try to strip them of citizenship, make them stateless. And I think they're going to use it against political opponents where they can, or at least try to deter them from speaking out.
I think that's absolutely true. And that's not just oh, we're reading one line of something that came out that's just a press release. That
No.
was a goal in the first administration, and they were not able to do much with it. And so it is actually something that is now 6 or 7 years old, as something that was said to be important to Stephen Miller at the time. They created an office to try to do it. And this is clearly the fruition of that. And I want to roll back to something that you said, where you were talking about Russia. And I've done a lot of work in Russia, and I believe that the sort of turning point for Russia to have very great difficulty for its people to save it in any way, the people who are against Putin, is this moment that we are unfortunately echoing right this second, which was Putin was in the presidency and then out and came back, although he never really left his control. Just as Trump kept control of the party while he was out, Putin was still really controlling a lot of what was happening in Russia, even in those 4 years away from the presidency. But after he returned in 2012, a few years after that, in 2016, he created what was called the Rosguardia. It's still called that. And it's the Russian National Guard. And it was used, and we don't know exactly how many people it has, but it's estimated to have more than 300,000 people in it. And it is used to, and it was formed ahead of the next election, and it was used to put down public dissent. And once you had that tremendous internal police force to quash public defense, public dissent, and once he was able to then just start targeting his political rivals, then at that point, for a domestic dissent movement to rise up in any significant way, I believe became almost impossible. And that's one of my biggest concerns about this vast ICE police force that is rising up, that we're going to have in the states, that could rival the prison system in terms of detention capacity, because we have seen that in the case of Rosguardia, it's personally under the control of Putin. And in this case, ICE is effectively under the direct control of Donald Trump. And I think that we need to we need to stall this process, put the brakes on it before we end up with a police force beholden to the president, willing to do his will, and capable of squashing public dissent.
It, and that brings me to something else that was in your book about the a Nazi camp at Chemna. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct, outside of Dusseldorf,
Right.
and that some guards in the SA were convicted by local authorities of abusing prisoners. Hitler pardoned them. So the result was in the future that no one prosecuted. There was still at that point independent prosecutors, I take it. And that as you note in your book, then that was the end of prosecuting these people for wrongdoing, which I'm saying the flip side would be to embolden them to do anything they want. Donald Trump will use the pardon power for anyone. He did it for the terrorists who attacked our Capitol on January 6th to put him in power, to keep him in power. How concerning is that? And do you see that that's the same message that I take from the pardoning of the people, and that these ICE agents are be federal officers and are going to know deep down they can do anything to help Donald Trump because he will pardon them at the end of the day?
I think that that pardon power is a huge threat to all Americans right now. I would take also, along with the thing that you're drawing, the conclusion you're drawing, I would take a hopeful message from the Kenma story, which is that for right now, in my studies, what I found was the two most critical things for being able to move out of a concentration camp regime were to keep the right to protest, to publicly assemble in opposition to the government, and also to keep at least a somewhat independent judiciary. And what we have in the U.S. right now is a somewhat independent judiciary. I would argue the Supreme Court, that several members are compromised, at least a couple are pretty corrupt in pretty open ways. And so that is already damaged our country in a lot of ways. But we see the lower court rulings going overwhelmingly against the president's policies. And that might sound like it doesn't matter, because what if it just gets overruled at the upper levels? But you have a mutually reinforcing relationship between public mobilization and the courts actually saying what is true, the lower courts saying that. And we legitimize them and give them that confidence so they do not get shut down completely the way it happened in Nazi Germany. But they also legitimize public protest and make it harder and harder for the public who are in their silos and maybe only watching Fox or only listening to radio, that is right wing, that they are going to say, wait, there's all these people and they're saying we have to listen to these courts, we have to do this. Sometimes a way that the two feed into each other. There was just an article today by Andrew O'Donoghue talking about how in Israel, for instance, and in Brazil, threatening the courts and pressuring those court rulings and damaging that system led to demonstrations that allowed the courts to continue making rules that went against the government, that went against the ruling party. And I think those are things we have still have a lot of potential to do here in the US.
And that's an excellent point. And I had on my show a little over a month ago, Professor Stephen Levitsky from Harvard, who co-wrote the book, How Democracies Die. And I've had him on many times. When I had him on the first term, it was more like history, what's going on. Now we're living through it. But he made the exact same point that judges don't rule in a vacuum. And they have to see there's popular support or popular opposition to a regime, to an administration, and that it has an impact because they know they're not out there on their own. Because at the end of the day, the judges are human beings. They're not AI judicial bots that go, okay, here's your thing, and they spit out the reality of whatever sterile in a vacuum. That's not the truth. So that's really interesting, that the article there by Andrew O'Donoghue on that very point. You know, in your article, you also wrote the U.S. has already sent detainees to El Salvador, Panama, Rwanda, and Libya, among other nations, and that we are watching the imposition of a global concentration camp network. Why is this so jarring? Please share with me and everyone else why this catches your attention.
It catches my attention for a lot of reasons because camps evolve in worse ways over time. And one of the things we saw in the 1970s and 1980s in South America, in Chile and Argentina and some other places, was a network of countries, an operation that was called Operation Condor, and there was cross-border trafficking. So let's say somebody escaped Chile and wound up in another country, then the countries agreed, oh, I'll detain you. Maybe we'll torture him, or maybe we'll force him to come back to you. When you had this international network, it made it much harder for people to resist. It made it much harder to reestablish democracy. And the U.S. was very much in support of the regimes that were doing this. And I think this is now, we ourselves are not just doing this, but imposing it on the world. These people don't necessarily want to take the prisoners we're going to send them. We've heard the administration say that they are in negotiation with dozens of countries. And what that means is they're going to bully them or they're going to bribe them. Bukele in El Salvador was paid millions of dollars to hold these prisoners. And I don't know if you heard what happened today, but the court, it came out in a UN session that America, Bukele said that America still in charge of those prisoners. America still has control of them. They're just a holding facility for it. And this was in direct contravention of what had been said in a U.S. courtroom. We can't bring them back. We can't do anything. So just imagine the post 9/11 war on terror black sites that we put all over the world that were hidden, that were secret, that were least limited in how many there were. This is, again, that like comic, awful merch version of it. Right now, we're going to do it publicly. We're going to pay millions and millions of dollars for it. We're going to use it to subvert the justice system and not have any of these guys accountable to any court anywhere for what they're doing. And we are also going to create that fabric in the world of a global concentration camp system under the control of the most powerful nation on earth. It's a really awful possibility. We're already getting right into it.
You mentioned Obeidallah Garcia in El Salvador here. You know, Mr. Garcia has said recently through his lawyers that he was tortured in El Salvador, that he was forced to kneel from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. with the other inmates. Guards would strike anyone who fell from exhaustion. They were not giving bathroom breaks. He soiled himself. He was psychological torture like you would do to POWs in Abu Ghraib about things saying, we're going to put you in with the gangs. They're going to tear you to pieces, all that kind of stuff. Now that we know that sending people to El Salvador, and we knew this before, but now it's documented, it's in court filings, that El Salvador is involved in state-sponsored torture. Do you think this has an impact at all on this administration? And the other part of this, and something I wrote about a month ago, that I really wish the International Criminal Court of Justice would look into it, because while the U.S. is not a signatory, El Salvador is, and actions taken in signatory nations, even by non-citizens, but have the power to send people to a place like El Salvador, can expose them to criminal liability. And I really wish the ICJ would open an investigation to Donald Trump, Kristi Noem, Tom Homan, and others in this regime, because they are involved with crimes against humanity in El Salvador knowingly. Now, that's my view.
Well, and I wrote a piece a few weeks ago for the Globe and Mail in Canada saying that I think it's incumbent upon democratic countries to pressure, if they cannot directly pressure the US, although I believe they should try to, because ultimately it's our responsibility, they should target the countries that, even if they're doing it under pressure and threat from us, they should absolutely target those countries, and they should collaborate to do so to create a negative pressure so that this is less likely to happen. And for the people that would say, well, look, the Supreme Court just allowed those people, those 8 men, sent to South Sudan over the weekend. The Supreme Court just said that they can do it. I would come back with what I was saying before and what you just said, that lower court pressure brought Abrego Garcia back. There are 300 and some cases right now active, and every single one of those, no matter what happens at SCOTUS, getting Abrego Garcia back is a blow to the administration. Having his voice say what happened is something for the record. And whether that's a Nuremberg-style trial that we will do in the U.S. later, whether that's a global international action, whether that's condemnation at the UN, whatever other things it is, every single one of those things is another toehold by which we can slow or stop or eventually reverse what's going on. And we have to look at each of them. And if you just look at it sort of fatalistically, that if in the end SCOTUS says X, then we're screwed, then in reality, there's so much more. And creating that documentary record, that court record, even at the lower levels, is tremendous in terms of long-term justice, but also swaying public opinion right now.
And the Nuremberg trials is the exact model that I wrote about in my article. That, of course, that was after a war, and it was the victors who put the Nuremberg trials together. But perhaps we'll be liberated one day in America, and then the nations that liberate us will then put Donald Trump on trial, which would make me so happy. Last thing, you conclude your op-ed for MSNBC about the history of this kind of detention underlines that it would be a mistake to think the current cruelties are the end point. America is likely just getting started. So what can we do? What can you share from history about what might be effective to slow or stop this creep to truly a fascist police state that Donald Trump and MAGA dream of?
So, as I mentioned before, the independent judiciary and the right to protest are critical. So I encourage people to support legal aid organizations near you, to support bar associations where they are disbarring people that are bad actors in this field. Things that help the legal independence, things that help that are involved with protest. And that doesn't just mean, it does mean protesting nationally. It doesn't just mean that. What you do in your community on a small local level is absolutely critical. There's data showing that Black Lives Matter protests, some of the most influential protests, changed the vote in some of the biggest ways, actually happened in what demographically are deep red communities. And I suspect that it was because it might have been the first exposure they had to regular people who were saying this is wrong, because they either were totally checked out of politics or they were only hearing MAGA voices. And to see something other than that is critical. So even in your community, no matter what community it is, support the people being targeted, support the families of people who've been deported, figure out where ICE is detaining people near you. You might be surprised to find out where it is. Work with your city council to end partnerships, whether they're police partnerships or business partnerships. There are a million things you can do on the ground, but basically anything that ties us together as a community. When the government right now is looking to splinter us off from each other, the more we do mutual help for each other and stand up for everybody. And I don't mean that in a kumbaya way. I mean it literally. Show up on street corners, babysit kids whose mothers have to go to detention hearings. The more that you actually see how this is affecting your local community and you say something about it, the more likely you are to change the circumstances on the ground and change what gets voted on and how it gets voted in 2026.
So we still have the power. It's not done yet. It's not over. We saw massive protests a few weeks ago, which now have kind of faded from our psyche, but they gave me great hope when we had millions in the street. MAGA can't get millions in the street. They really can't. So Andrea, thank you so much. If people want to follow your work, what do you recommend they go to?
There's sort of one hub where you can see all the possibilities, and that's Andrea Pitzer, AndreaPitzer.com. And I have a newsletter, I have a podcast, I have books, I have a million things there. Thanks so much for having me
You're
on.
one-stop shopping for a lot of stuff. That's very good.
Exactly.
I have the same experience. This is what we do in today's world. When you want to get the message out, you've got to do it all different ways, from podcast to writing articles to talking and media shows. Thank you so much. Nice meeting you. That was a great article. I really loved your book. I'm going to finish it. I read most of it. It was very eye-opening, especially about, reading about how the communist leader in Nazi Germany was the only person to escape, and how important it was for him to get out after what he went through. It's interesting. And he was just a political prisoner. And if they would do what they did to him, it makes me concerned about what the potential is for the inhumanity of Trump, because I see it cut from the same cloth. But with that said, again, the book, One Long Night's a few years old, but it's a really great read. I can't recommend enough. Thanks so much. Nice meeting you. Look forward to chatting in the
Great
future.
to meet you. Thank you so much.